He has cut off our trade with all parts of the world. He has imposed taxes on us without our consent.
Welcome to Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness, a podcast commemorating the 250-year anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. The show is sponsored by the Amerikazentrum in Hamburg, Germany, and I'm your host, Andrew Sola. Today we'll be taking an entirely different approach to the Declaration of Independence by focusing on a very important commodity. A commodity that fueled sailors and seamen, diplomats and drunks, priests and pirates. It was prized by planters in Jamaica, traders in Boston, and slavers in Africa. It was such an important commodity that taxing it helped cause the American War of Independence. It's been known throughout history as tot, grog, screech, pirate juice, demon water, Nelson's blood, and kill devil. Of course, I'm not talking about tea, I'm talking about rum. And our episode today is about rum and the Declaration of Independence. What is rum and how is it made? Who drank rum and where did they drink it? Why was it such an important commodity throughout the Atlantic world? How did British laws affecting the rum trade lead to the War of Independence? And of course, why is rum associated with pirates? I'm most interested in that. So, here with me today to explain the importance of rum and the Declaration of Independence is the world's leading expert on the history of rum in the Americas, Jordan B. Smith. Welcome, Jordan.
Thank you very much for having me.
Jordan Smith is Associate Professor of History at Widener University in Pennsylvania, where he specializes in the history of early America in global and Atlantic contexts. His book, The Invention of Rum, Creating the Quintessential Atlantic Commodity, was published by University of Pennsylvania Press in 2025. A link is in the show notes. So, Jordan, why don't you just start with the basics here? What is rum and how is it made?
So rum is the distilled spirit made out of the waste products of sugar production, kind of in a historic sense. And so in the plantations of the Americas, when sugarcane was damaged during storms, when rats got to it, when drought came and the sugarcane was no longer able to be reduced into granular sugar, it could instead be collected, taken to the distillery. It could be added together with water, with molasses, leftover byproducts of sugar production. And all of that would be kind of fermented, allowing the sugars to turn into alcohol, loaded up into a still, which is a closed system where you heat the whole mixture up and you're able to extract most of the alcohol and only some of the water as a stronger alcohol. And after a couple of runs through a still, you would have rum, initially kind of clear, very strong, slightly sweet, but also heavily alcoholic. And then you could conceivably age it into a more desired and slightly smoother beverage. And so rum remains really popular today. One difference is that in the 17th and 18th century, rum was made out of waste products. Nowadays, much of the rum is actually made from sugar instead of the molasses and other waste that was repurposed.
Great. So rum you characterize as the quintessential Atlantic commodity. So why don't you just tell us how it started in the Atlantic? I mean, I guess rum has existed, or at least sugar-based alcohols. I guess all alcohols are sugar-based. But you call it in your book a quintessentially Atlantic commodity. So why don't you talk about that part of the history, please?
Absolutely. So the first thing that I would point out is something that differentiates rum from some other commodities that historians and kind of the general public have been really interested in, is that rum was omnipresent, right? Rum touched the kind of business lives and the individual lives of a vast majority of people living around the Atlantic basin in the 17th and 18th century. And I think that gives us a really unique view into the Atlantic world, as well as kind of parts of the Atlantic world like colonial and revolutionary North America. So the argument that I make in the book is that rum is a product of that Atlantic world. And so the ingredients and the supplies necessary to make rum, whether that's sugarcane, whether that's copper or pewter stills, whether that's knowledge of fermentation and even distillation, all of those things existed in different parts of the Atlantic world before colonization and before the settlement of the Caribbean by Europeans in the 1600s and 1700s. But rum did not exist prior to the collision of cultures, the collision of indigenous American cultures, West African cultures, and British and European cultures. And so the book tracks how different ideas of alcohol and how it was made and who could consume it. It tracks how those intersected in a place like Barbados, starting in the 1620s and 1630s and 1640s, to create something new. And that new thing initially was called Kill Devil or rum bouillon, but eventually by the mid to late 17th century was known kind of throughout different parts of the Atlantic world as rum.
Cool. And let's just talk about that first stage of the process, which is also perhaps the most terrifying if you were having to work on a sugar plantation. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that first stage in making rum? What was it like?
So one of the things that was unique or kind of new in French and British islands in the West Indies, so places like, well, the ones that I focus on the most are kind of Barbados and Jamaica early on and Antigua as well, is that they pioneered a new way of producing sugar. And it was this idea of like an integrated plantation complex where a plantation would be made up of fields where sugar cane was grown, as well as the sites of early processing. And so when sugarcane's cut, you have maybe 24 or 48 hours until it begins to sour to the point that it can no longer be turned into that highly prized sugar. And so rather than relying on mills and boiling houses somewhere else, which was the model in places like Brazil, British Caribbean planters instead moved those processes onto the individual plantations. So usually you would have centralized mills, maybe powered by water or powered by wind or even powered by livestock moving around. And then you would have these kind of initial industrial steps taking place where you would boil to purify the sugar and eventually put it into molds to kind of solidify into hardened granular sugar. Part of that process is that there is a lot of waste produced through the manufacture of sugar. And those wastes also became part of that integrated plantation complex because the distilleries were built where you could gather these supplies. For the most part, this work was too brutal. The conditions too excruciating, the disease climate too deadly for many people to choose on their own to move to the Caribbean to undertake this labor. And so in the 17th century and into the 18th century, there were a variety of coercive labor regimes, whether that was forcing prisoners from Northern Europe, whether that was through indentured servitude, where people gave up the rights to their labor for a period of time in exchange for free passage and room and board, and also increasingly racialized slavery of indigenous Americans and increasingly Western Africans who were taken from West Africa against their will and enslaved on Caribbean plantations. The work tended to be from sunup till sundown. The immediacy of needing to turn sugar cane into granular sugar meant that sometimes the work went into the evenings. And there are really kind of excruciating accounts of the lived experience of kind of the danger that the sweetness of cane unleashed on its producers.
Yeah, it's a fascinating history. And going back to this idea of sugar being a commodity, what we have then is it's been so sort of highly studied and perfected over the years that basically you might call it like a franchise model like McDonald's or Subway or something, where you know that you need a certain amount of land on a certain island and a certain number of enslaved people and a certain number of like overseers and then the machinery to process the sugar. And that, you know, once you plop it down, it guarantees you X amount of profits per year, right? I mean, that's how developed it becomes over the course of the centuries as the sugar industry is developing, yeah?
In theory, I think that planters and would-be planters from kind of Britain or perhaps from the Americas who want to set up sugar plantations, they hope it will work that way. One of the arguments that I make in the book is that if we focus on rum, that by its very definition is a waste product, we have a chance to focus on how plantations worked rather than how people hoped that they worked. And so what I mean by that is you might think that you have a sense of what the labor force that you might want to rely on consists of, but you're reliant on people, even under systems of duress, being willing to carry out that labor. You might think that you need a certain number of plantation operators, overseers. You might even know that you're required by law due to deficiency laws to have a certain number of people in place. But that doesn't mean that you can find people willing to take on that role. You might think that you know what it takes to grow sugar, but what happens when a hurricane hits? What happens when fire ravages the fields of sugarcane fields? So what my research has uncovered is that there's a lot of kind of negotiation and conflict sometimes on the ground as, again, kind of plantation owners and operators, merchants have an idea of how commodities are made. But the very idea of rum in the first place is an acknowledgement that things don't always go as planned.
Fascinating. Okay, let's move the story from that first stage, the sugar plantation, now to, say, the colonies where you have your first distilleries.
Yeah, so my book kind of begins in the Caribbean and tells a story of rum being invented through the collision of different groups of people looking for a new way to kind of satisfy desires, thirsts, tastes for alcohol with the ingredients that they have available. And so that's happening in the mid 17th century in places like Barbados and eventually Jamaica. But by the 1660s and certainly by the 1680s, people in other parts of the Atlantic world are thinking about how they can integrate kind of the labor and the expertise devised in the Caribbean and other places. And so by the 1680s, about 3 million gallons of molasses, 3 million liters of molasses per year were being exported from Barbados. And around the same time, in a letter to John Winthrop, the governor of Massachusetts, it was stated that molasses is vendible in no part of the world but New England and Virginia. And the insinuation of the letter was that they would send more of that molasses to New England, to Massachusetts.
What does vendible mean?
Saleable, right? Okay. Or there's only a market for the molasses in New England and Virginia. And so by that early date, there were already some distilleries in place in Massachusetts, and the number of distilleries and their kind of movement from maybe being a side hustle for a family into a central kind of business component of kind of family's kind of economic endeavors only intensified. And so one thing that was happening is that in the Caribbean, some of this early rum is being made with these slightly soured cane juice or the refuse products that kind of were inefficiencies in the system. In Massachusetts and other North American cities, the distilleries increasingly relied solely on molasses, which is the syrup that couldn't be hardened into sugar, that would kind of drain out of sugar as it was curing. So that molasses would be stored up, it would be barreled, it would be sent to North American cities. So as you noted earlier, plantations relied on centralizing different economic endeavors in different stages of a commodity process within sight of each other. Whereas these North American distilleries instead relied on an imported cheap ingredient that could be further processed into something that was also called rum, although it was often seen as a slightly less desirable version of rum than what was produced in the Caribbean.
Okay, let's move on then to who's drinking it. So it's produced in these distilleries, and then because we're just trying to paint a full picture of everything here. It's molasses is produced, or it's a byproduct of the sugar-making process in the sugar islands. It's transported to the big cities in the colonies, the first stills in Boston and New York. They're making it now. Now, what is the next step on the voyage of our rum?
So for both rum produced in the Caribbean and produced in North America, one of its kind of greatest attributes was that almost everybody was drinking it. And so if you were kind of drinking in a tavern or a private home in Philadelphia or Charleston or Boston or New York, you were probably consuming rum. Maybe plain, maybe watered down with a little bit of citrus or sugar, often as a rum punch, which was a mixture of sugar and citrus and alcohol and water. If you were engaged in the transatlantic slave trade, and you were engaged in that trade from British North America, you were from the late 17th century exchanging in part in rum. If you worked in the fisheries off of the coast of North America, that was rum was a common kind of trade good and kind of consumable among those populations of fishermen. Native people living and kind of governing themselves in North America and in the Northeast were consuming rum, or sometimes choosing not to. But there were rum trades that integrated many different groups of people throughout the Atlantic world. And the availability of rum is kind of well documented in North America from the last quarter or so of the 17th century throughout the 18th century. This was in many places, and I would argue in most places, the most common spirit that would have been consumed.
Right, and I think it's important just to stress what you said about the slave trade, that indeed it was basically used as currency, a gallon of rum, and I think there are documents, historical documents, that indicate how much an enslaved person is worth or was sold for however many liters of rum, right?
Yeah, and one of the things to keep in mind is that in the transatlantic slave trade, I argue in the book that North American rum producers and then kind of slave trade merchants were able to kind of enter parts of the transatlantic slave trade because they were willing to adjust what their rum kind of tasted like and looked like to meet the demand of slave traders on the coast of West Africa who were often Africans themselves. Rum in and of itself was not often capable of unlocking market transactions in people, but it was part of what is sometimes called sorted cargoes, mixed where rum alongside kind of cloth and other European commodities were kind of bundled, and then they could be used to purchase people.
I want to focus on maybe some other alcohols now, because obviously rum wasn't the only alcohol, not the only prized alcoholic commodity. So I think we need to maybe just for a minute step away from the British sugar islands and the production of rum in the colonies to brandy, French brandy in the French Empire. So do you just want to take a little detour here? What is the the competition looking like? French brandy, which is hugely popular, hugely available, and really a direct competitor, and maybe even you could say a threat to the French Empire.
Yeah, so one thing to keep in mind is that the 17th century was a very important moment in the history of distilled spirits, in that the technology of spreading copper and other metals had improved to the point that it was possible to build larger stills than might have been available in previous centuries. And so it's not that distilled spirits were new in the 17th century, but these new technologies and the availability of large quantities of sugar meant that they could be produced more efficiently. And that does substantively change what the distilled spirits market looks like. If you were kind of a British imperial official in the 17th century, you might know that many individuals had developed a taste for brandy made out of usually probably grapes, not grown in any great scale in England or Scotland itself, which meant that the brandy normally needed to be imported across imperial lines. And in a kind of mercantilist system, and with kind of the political economy and the economic beliefs underpinning that system, the idea was that if you were buying these imported goods in large quantities, you were siphoning wealth to your imperial competitors. And so there was a real incentive for the British to find kind of a domestic or imperial alternative to that brandy. And rum emerges at a moment where the British are thinking, hey, we can produce this rum, and then people might consume this rum instead of brandy. Now, it remained imperfect in that many elites preferred brandy. Once somebody has a taste for something, it's sometimes hard to substitute a different commodity for it. That was like the kind of center of kind of decision making about kind of how the British would ultimately support rum production. The flip side of that story is equally interesting. The French, in particular, had a very established brandy industry that was important for leading kind of domestic producers. And so rum, even if it was produced, or rum or something like it, even if it was produced in the French Caribbean islands, was seen as a threat to domestic commodity production and an important driver of the French economy. So as early as 1713, a French law goes onto the books banning the distillation of sugar-derived spirits in France, and also limiting the trade of those distilled spirits that would look a lot like rum, taste a lot like rum, sometimes called Gildive or Tafia. Those could no longer be produced, or they couldn't be traded from the French West Indies to other parts of the world. And so we see this kind of moment of divergence where the British Atlantic world comes to kind of identify with rum and see it as an economic engine of empire, whereas the French see it as a threat to the economics of France itself. There are other competitors too. And so again, in the moment that this waste product called rum is becoming more popular, not just in the Caribbean, not just in North America, but also in Britain, Britons are also developing a new relationship with the Dutch. They are becoming enamored with Genever. They create their own version that the theory is, or the idea is, that they would take kind of cheap grain-based alcohols. They would add botanicals, including juniper, and they would market it as gin. And in a moment where, in the aftermath of kind of William and Mary ascending to the throne, there was a craze for many things Dutch. And so in some ways, in Britain itself, the competitor for rum might be another affordable spirit in the form of gin. Again, in the book, I think about how some of that gin was actually made from molasses-derived spirits, or spirits made from sugar. And I tie kind of changes to how people were thinking about working class consumption of alcohol as not being just about gin, but about being gin and rum. And so I make the argument that the gin craze, that moment of Hogarth's famous print of a Britain out of control because they're consuming too many distilled spirits, that coincides with similar conversations around the same time in Jamaica, where Port Royal's destruction in the late 17th century is memorialized as a biblical story of the Sodom of the West Indies falling into the sea, or where a hysteria, nothing less than a hysteria, surrounding Native American drinking patterns in North America is again a question of elites in the British world coming to terms with people who they expected to extract labor from consuming alcohol in ways that they found destabilizing of the power structures that they had built their society on.
Yeah, and so you just mentioned sort of this moral tinge to the entire history of rum. Why don't you just talk a little bit about the religious context of rum at the time? And I promise then we will get to the American colonies and talk about the American Revolution. But this is so fascinating.
Yeah. So there are so many different religious connotations for rum. In the early 17th or in the mid 17th century, there are questions about whether different alcoholic spirits produced in the Americas could replace wine in communion, right? Keep in mind that wine or beer, traditional kind of alcohols consumed in Europe, were really hard to stop from spoiling as they crossed the Atlantic Ocean. So there are questions about whether other alcohols, other kind of American or Atlantic alcohols, could fulfill religious purposes in those spaces. There are questions about whether good Christians should be drinking rum, and Increase and Cotton Mather are deeply concerned about rum's place in Massachusetts society in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. They liken a Massachusetts flooded by rum as a Dead Sea, to kind of borrow some of the religious language. What I find really interesting is that the Mathers realize pretty quickly that they are not going to stop all Americans from drinking rum. And instead they suggest that certain Americans, ministers and leaders of communities, need to be careful about their consumption of rum. But the religious kind of questions about whether you, like how much rum you should be drinking and in what context, continue with kind of religious sects that consider temperance, and also with kind of the evangelical component of the abolitionist movement in the aftermath of the American, during and then in the aftermath of the American Revolution, where certain religious groups increasingly see slavery as something that they need to adjust their consumer behaviors around, and use kind of religious communities and networks to try to affect the end of slavery through non-consumption of sugar and rum and other slave-produced products.
Yeah, and maybe we'll come back to that, because that might be the kind of the most interesting for me from a modern perspective here, and looking back. You know, we have sort of, we boycott certain products when we think that they're morally impure for some reason. And thinking back then, as sort of anti-slavery sentiment is rising, if everyone sort of knew that slavery and this product were intimately connected, you could see very easily that you would want to disassociate yourself from essentially a product made with slave labor.
Yes. And so this is very tied to, I think, where our conversation might head in a little bit, because...
Yeah, so just briefly, because we'll get here later.
Okay, so there are two things going on. One is that in the immediate years leading up to the American Revolution, Americans realize that they can affect kind of political decision-making through what they choose to consume or not consume. And so that's kind of the non-consumption movement surrounding things like the Stamp Act and Townsend Acts and Tea Act. The other thing that happens is that the Declaration of Independence unleashes new conversations about some very big and very powerful ideas. The idea of kind of innate human rights and that all men are created equal. And that jumpstarts the abolitionist movement in Britain and what became the United States in different ways. And so within a generation, political techniques kind of pioneered, or at least kind of used in new ways during the American Revolution, are directed toward other political movements, including trying to affect the cessation of the slave trade and slavery.
Cool. And we're going to get back to that. Now we're going to start our journey here in the 13 colonies. And I think a good time to start would be the Molasses Act of 1733. We know how important now molasses is to the rum industry, so why don't you just talk about this first Molasses Act, please? So, again, in the early 18th century, the French start to limit the uses of molasses within their own empire. And something that happens pretty quickly is that merchants, both American merchants, but also French merchants, look for another outlet for those sugary byproducts. And so by 1723, there are complaints that there are 16 distilleries in New York that are wholly supplied from Martinique. And for the British, again, in kind of this mercantilist system, this is seen as a threat to some of the products of their own plantations. And so a variety of different ideas circulate about whether
The trade of molasses to North America should be entirely stopped. And ultimately what's decided is that it's going to be heavily regulated through taxes. And again, there are different reasons why kind of taxes are enacted at different points in the 18th century. One is about regulating vice, and so rum becomes the source of those sorts of taxes. One is about the regulation of commerce, which American colonists normally agree that the British have the right to tax for that purpose. And we'll get into it a little bit later, but one is about kind of the generation of revenue. So the Molasses Act is the source of extended negotiation, and ultimately the duty placed on molasses in that 1733 Act is quite high. And it is seen by many distillers or merchants in North America as prohibitively high. In the immediate aftermath of the Molasses Act, the rum industry in a place like Massachusetts declines. I think maybe 40% of distilleries seem to close. That decline lasts for a couple of years, but pretty quickly merchants and distillers start to find ways around the Molasses Act. And so there are a variety of different techniques used to smuggle, sometimes in the Caribbean where molasses might be moved to entrepôts like St. Eustatius where American merchants could trade. Sometimes the molasses would be taken from small French islands and kind of imported into British islands and then repackaged as British molasses. Sometimes it would be snuck into small ports or even kind of small waterways in the North American colonies. There was also a lot of paying bribes to customs officials. And so the cost of smuggling added some cost to the importation of molasses, but it was cheaper than these prohibitive duties. And so as the 18th century progressed, even with kind of a law on the books that in theory would really limit, perhaps cripple North American rum production, we see a steady increase in the number of distilleries in just about every North American colony.
And I'm happy now that you mentioned St. Eustatius, because now we can talk about pirates. Because, of course, St. Eustatius is a Dutch colony that is pretty much open to whatever's going on. They're happy to trade with, as the Dutch often were, with whoever wants to trade, no matter what laws are violated. And St. Eustatius is known as quite the pirate's den, isn't it?
Yeah, and I would argue kind of much of the Caribbean is the center of piracy in certain moments, and then smuggling and an under-regulated trade in other moments. And there are a lot of accusations where some people might think of a particular behavior as piracy, and then others think of it as just the way things were going on in the Caribbean or happening in the Caribbean at the time.
Yeah, is that where we get our association with rum and piracy? I'm just curious. This is a totally off our historical narrative now, but where do you think the first associations come from? Is it from St. Eustatius, or had it existed already?
So I actually think that some of the ways in which we uniquely connect pirates and rum happens after all of this. Okay. What I will say is I 100% agree that pirates who, as Marcus Rediker suggests, were motivated by an attitude of a short life but a good one, drank all sorts of alcohol in incredible quantities. But guess what? So did almost everybody else. Okay. And so the book includes stories of pirates or privateers in Port Royal in the 1680s, drinking large amounts of alcohol, buying prodigious quantities of rum, but also things like wine, and harassing people in the streets as they kind of just drank this or even kind of just sprayed alcohol on passersby. But also keep in mind that I would imagine we might talk about this in a few minutes, but when the British institute a rum ration for the Navy, that's 5 or 6 modern day servings of alcohol that's being given to sailors daily, sometimes at one time. And so there's a lot of people who are drinking a lot of rum. They're also drinking other things when they have the money to afford different things. The unique connection between piracy and rum that suggests that pirates did something else, I think is a remnant of Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, where kind of in the midst of a temperance movement in Britain, Robert Louis Stevenson writes a book for children that is meant to impart certain lessons. And if you read that book, and I do every year in my teaching, first of all, the doctor, Dr. Livesey, is the name of the most famous temperance advocate in 19th century Britain. But furthermore, most of the time when somebody's consuming rum, it's a pirate. It's not that Jim and his cohort don't drink, but they're drinking brandy or they're drinking wine. And Treasure Island, which then inspires a lot of different popular culture, including Pirates of the Caribbean, continues that trend or kind of establishes that trend of thinking of pirates as uniquely consuming huge amounts of rum. And so I wrote about this a little bit in a recent article called Where's the Pirate for Commonplace. It's not to say that pirates aren't important for my story, but they become kind of more attached to rum later on.
All right, let's move on with our story in the colonies. So we have the Molasses Act of 1733, and now we're going to jump ahead to the Sugar Act of 1763. And again, in these intervening periods, what we have is a bunch of stuff, and I just want to quickly go through this. We have this new culture of now avoiding the molasses tax. So you have all these people clandestinely trying to avoid the tax. I think it's fair to say that the molasses tax wasn't so successful because people just ended up avoiding it in various ways. So it didn't quite raise the revenue that the British Empire wanted. And that takes us to the Sugar Act of 1763, which again happens at the end of the 7 Years' War, the end of the French and Indian War, and the purpose of, or one of the purposes of the act, again, is to sort of make the imperial coffers full by taxing the colonists. And I'll just note from the Sugar Act of 1763, it says that the point of the act is to, quote, more effectually prevent the clandestine conveyance of goods to and from the said colonies and plantations, namely the sugar colonies in America. So we're getting closer to the Declaration of Independence, but now we're at the Sugar Act of 1763. What should we remember about this in connection to rum?
I think you did a really good job of tying the Sugar Act to the 7 Years' War. A couple of things I would point out is that the 7 Years' War was incredibly expensive. North Americans felt that they had carried a lot of the water in the 7 Years' War as it was fought in North America. They were dissatisfied that they might not reap some of the rewards that they thought in terms of being able to expand, being able, in some people's eyes, to kind of eradicate or at least challenge Catholicism in North America. They were generally dissatisfied with what had happened, but the British were dissatisfied by what they saw as North Americans continuing to trade with the enemy, sometimes during the 7 Years' War. They had seen this kind of consumer society in North America emerge that clearly had money to buy a lot of things, but that were not paying kind of their share of the taxes in the idea or in the minds of the British. So keep in mind that generally the tax burden for somebody living in England would have been 20 times what the annual tax burden was for somebody living in Massachusetts, which was the most taxed colony of the 13 colonies that we think of declaring independence. When you go a little bit north to New Hampshire colonists were paying 1/100th of the taxes of the average Englishman. And so there's this idea that there needs to be some sort of imperial reform to make the colonies pay for more than they were paying for. So both the colonies and the British had different ideas of how to raise revenue through taxes. They had used in the Molasses Act of 1733 and other similar legislation. They had seen taxes as a means to regulate trade. In the aftermath of the gin craze in 1736, they had experimented with taxes to control vice. I would add that a third idea, one thing that kind of came out of both of these taxes was they didn't really challenge the demand for rum. So they kind of defied what you might expect from a rational economic standpoint. People just seemed willing to pay those taxes. And so a variety of both kind of the British sometimes put as many as 12 or 14 different duties on distilled spirits. But American colonies from North Carolina up to Massachusetts at different moments, New York, at different moments taxed rum as a means to raise revenue. But the Sugar Act of 1764, which both was meant to regulate trade, but some people also saw as a means to raise revenue, became controversial. And it was an interesting tax because it actually lowered the duties from the 1730s, but it increased the enforcement mechanisms. Now all of a sudden there would be British naval vessels off of the coast of North America to cut down on the smuggling. And the idea was that you might charge less, but if you increased your enforcement, you might make more money. The hope, I think, among some kind of British officials was that they were charging so little that it might be cheaper to just pay the taxes than to smuggle. But that didn't quite happen that way.
Just a quick question before you move on. I've seen it noted as the Sugar Act being in 1763 or 1764, and it's a minor point, but I'm kind of interested in why these two dates appear.
If I remember correctly, I think it becomes kind of operational in 1764.
Okay, so it's like passed in 63, and then, like with the Canada Act, it actually comes into force the next year. It's just curious.
I believe so, yeah.
Okay, so back to our story. So we are at the Sugar Act of 1764 and the reasons for it, right? And then the hope of the British Empire that people will start paying this tax and not trading with St. Eustatius anymore. And I might note that in St. Eustatius, they were very angry with the sugar tax as well. They didn't like the British, the Royal Navy, in their business, as we would say.
Yeah, and I would say, like, seemingly everybody's upset with the Sugar Act. People who ultimately decided to side with the Loyalist cause a decade later are deeply troubled by the Sugar Act and what it means to kind of the North American business climate in the 1760s. Yeah, so there's a lot of dissatisfaction. There's protesting that kind of leads into as well kind of the Stamp Act. This is one of my students call this like if they're identifying this, they just call it one of the acts, right? One of these 1760s pieces of legislation that becomes controversial. Within a couple of years, they actually cut the tax rate again, but is becoming. It's kind of the opening salvo in an ongoing attempt to make kind of the North American economy pay for itself in new ways. One of the things that I would note in the 1760s is that I don't see the Sugar Act as the end of smuggling. I see other forms of smuggling. I see a variety of different things, but there are also several pretty notable instances of North American sailors or kind of townspeople in ports directly confronting customs officials as they seek to collect this revenue. And so there are towns in New England especially who will tell you that something that happened in their town was the first kind of violence of the American Revolution, often in the 1760s. And a lot of times that has to do with the enforcement of the Sugar Act in a variety of ways where customs officials sometimes feel under attack, feel that they're kind of held hostage in certain circumstances, that they're forcibly stopped from collecting the revenues that they've been empowered to collect.
Okay, let's move our story along because we are getting closely to the battles of Lexington and Concord and the Declaration of Independence then in 1776. So we all know, and those of you who've been listening to the series, you know what's going on in this period. There's a slow move towards greater anger against King George and the Parliament in London. More and more acts are passed that make colonists more and more unhappy. And eventually we now get to the Declaration of Independence, where we see those two phrases, grievance number 16, he has cut off our trade with all parts of the world, and grievance 17, he has imposed taxes on us without our consent. And all of this goes back to your very specific history of rum. So why don't you talk about those two grievances and why those two specifically are in the Declaration and why they have to do with rum?
So I think, again, the molasses trade and then the rum trade as well, which are obviously closely intertwined, are integral to the North American economy by the time of the American Revolution. It's a hard number to count, but by 1770, John McCusker suggests that there were 140 rum distilleries in North America, as far south as Georgia, up to New Hampshire, but actually even beyond in colonies that are in modern-day Canada. And there is a segment of people that kind of describe the American Revolution in terms where they want free trade. Right? And I think that there are some limits to kind of what they imagine with free trade, but different imperial decisions that make it harder for North American merchants to accumulate the goods that are central to their industries are certainly one topic of considerable concern. And so too are taxes. And not just any tax, right? There's a longer history of taxing rum and even molasses, but taxes that the American colonists do not have an ability to kind of debate or to enact on themselves. And instead they're imposed on them from a parliament that they have no representation in. And so just because rum is such a central part of the American economy in this moment, I would imagine that when people usually heard the Declaration of Independence read to them, but maybe if they read it too, when they looked at these grievances, they were thinking about the rum industry and the rum that many of them consumed on a regular basis.
Okay, so as we've been talking about this, Jordan, and I was thinking about these two grievances, grievance 16 about trade and grievance 17 about taxing us without our consent, I oftentimes always think of this deleted passage from the Declaration of Independence about slavery, which we've talked about a number of times in this podcast series. We've been talking about rum, and rum is so deeply connected to slavery, and everyone knew it, right? So as we're thinking of the Declaration of Independence, is there a way of and connecting rum to all this and slavery? I mean, for me, it seems like that deleted passage means a little bit more to me now, because by not putting that in there, it's also kind of saying, well, we're not going to talk about slavery in the Declaration, and so we don't have to really think too much about our precious rum that we all like drinking. So we'll just get rid of this and sort of put it underneath the bed and ignore it.
Yeah, when I'm teaching the Declaration of Independence to my students, we read that rough draft, and the students congregate to that missing clause. And the way in which we talk about it, I ask, why do you think that is taken out? And the point that they make, and I tend to agree with, is that it was a place where perhaps the framers of the Declaration of Independence were out in front of some of the people that they were kind of relying on to sign this document, especially some of the colonies that they wanted to sign this document. I think that the story of rum in the 18th century is in part a story showing the expansiveness of slavery vis-a-vis the American colonies. And so it might have been that certain southern colonies wanted to avoid a mention of slavery in the Declaration of Independence. But as the Declaration of Independence was being debated, all 13 of those colonies still had slavery on the books. And I make the argument in the book that the distilleries of New England, and most of these North American distilleries, not all of them, but most of them were in Rhode Island and Massachusetts and other New England colonies. Those distilleries relied more than many industries on enslaved people to conduct the work. And so rum is tied up in slavery in places that we don't often associate with slavery in North America at the eve of the American Revolution. It's also tied up with America's continuing involvement in the transatlantic slave trade, which I'll give a little bit of a spoiler, actually only increases in the aftermath of the American Revolution.
That's fascinating. I assumed, perhaps incorrectly, that the only enslaved people in the North, or the vast majority, were, as it were, house help, right? But you're saying actually that in the distilleries there were enslaved people in New England.
Yes. Many of the distilleries relied on usually small numbers of enslaved people working in those distilleries. And even
that's okay then.
I point out because I think the experience of slavery is different or certainly was different on a kind of Caribbean plantation where in some ways the conditions may have been, or like often were, especially excruciating, more deadly, shorter lifespans, things like that. But also there were kind of enslaved communities, whereas the experience of slavery in kind of northern cities where these distilleries were located was different, right? You often had less distance from your enslaver in your day-to-day kind of work environment. And you might not have kind of the same community that was possible in other places. So it's not, I don't think it's I'm not trying to make comparisons of slavery.
No, it's interesting. And I think it's important that we do remember that slavery existed on this huge spectrum of the absolute total inhuman brutality of the Sugar Islands to the less horrible, potentially less horrible physical, brutal nature of it in, say, the distilleries in New England.
Yeah. And again, like the distilleries still, right? Like I think that it's still like the point that sometimes enslaved people made in the era of the American Revolution was if they were drawing comparisons between their experiences, they would point out, but I was still enslaved. I still didn't control my labor or my body. And, that was the case if you were a man by the name of Pompey working in a 1760s Philadelphia distillery owned by the Chevaliers, for instance.
Yeah, well, I'm thinking specifically of Crispus Attucks at the moment. I wonder what jobs he was doing outside of Boston when he escaped slavery.
I think he was a sailor in part. I can't remember. He
became a sailor after his escape, but I guess he was so young when he escaped. I wonder what he was sort of being trained to do when he would be fully working. But anyway, that's another history. Yes. Let us actually skip through the War of Independence now and look a little bit at rum and the state of abolition and the state of slavery in the brand new United States after the War of Independence.
So the first thing I would say is that anti-slavery ideas are as old as slavery itself. Enslaved people did not want to be enslaved and were the first abolitionists and absolutely must be a part of kind of our stories, our histories of abolition. That being said, the really big and powerful ideas embodied in the Declaration of Independence, the idea of innate human rights, the idea that all men are created equal, opened up new ground in the anti-slavery debate. And here I think Christopher Leslie Brown's book, Moral Capital, remains kind of a beacon in thinking about how in the era of the Declaration of Independence and in the earliest years of kind of the United States independent history, abolitionists had kind of new power tied to these human rights that they enacted to try to force the end of the slave trade and ultimately slavery. And these were very much tied up in religious communities, at times, kind of an evangelical Christian community, as well as Quakers becoming more and more outspoken in their opposition to slavery. And there are other things going on in the same time, right? Like the ideals of the American Revolution. People have kind of noted that these Enlightenment ideals play out in places other than the United States. And so that there are, I think like Laurent Dubois' work on the Haitian Revolution kind of makes a big point of kind of how some of these Enlightenment ideals play out as formerly enslaved people and people of African descent in Saint-Domingue declare independence through a brutal revolution in the 1780s and 1790s. And I'm reminded of a quotation from an unnamed prisoner pulled out by CLR James, where they say in the 1790s, quote, "We have a right to burn what we cultivate because a man has a right to dispose of his labor." And so again, sometimes enslaved or formerly enslaved people are making these connections between what's being produced by slave labor and an abolitionist movement. But abolitionists in places like Britain and in places like the United States, especially in the northern United States, but in different parts of the United States, also make this point kind of in the aftermath of non-consumption in the lead up to the American Revolution, which attacks the commodities, kind of reliant on trade elsewhere in the British Empire. They are kind of repurposing some of those dynamics in an abolitionist moment and in an abolitionist movement. And so as the Haitian Revolution is kind of raging in the late 1780s, early 1790s, there's also a concerted effort and a widespread campaign to get everyday British people, and also the same kind of texts are being republished in the United States, to challenge slavery through their consumer choices. And so a lot of times you can find kind of these sugar dishes that have kind of abolitionist phrases on them. There's also this amazing punch bowl, 4-rum punch, that's held at the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, where on one side there are likenesses of Benjamin Franklin and George Washington. And on the other side, there is an anti-slavery kind of phrase or stanza of a poem connecting, I think, the ideals of American independence further than many leading Americans were willing to go in the 1780s and 1790s. And so if you're trying to make sense of this as an American in the 1780s and 1790s, you're trying to make sense of the abolitionist movement. You're also trying to make sense of the fact that you just fought a war to kind of become independent from Britain and its restrictions on trade, which gets back to that kind of passage of the American Revolution. And now the hard part is upon you. Now you're trying to kind of operationalize that. And so in one of the kind of, I think, most interesting twists of this moment, people and Americans in particular, in some ways, are trying to make sense of like how they might change their relationship to slavery, but especially slavery as it's practiced in the Caribbean. And something like maple sugar holds a lot of promise in some people's eyes. And so the idea is that there are these vast forests in kind of western parts of existing states. Oftentimes the land is actively being expropriated from native people. You've got all these trees. And what if you harvest the maple syrup from those trees and turn it into sugar? Well, the problem is you still have to have a replacement for rum. And so a lot of energy is expended. And, Thomas Jefferson's writing letters about this. George Washington's tasting kind of these prototypes to make, like, basically turn the sugar bushes of America, as they're sometimes called, into free labor sources, and not just free labor, but independent sources of these commodities that Americans have determined that they can't do without. And so they try. I think that as with many kind of speculative ventures, people had great ideas of what was possible. They probably overestimated the potential of maple sugar and maple sugar rum. But the idea of maple sugar rum explains kind of movement into Western New York, places like Cooperstown, New York, Northwestern Pennsylvania. And it actually, if you go into the 19th century, it reappears as American kind of colonizing projects moved to Ohio and other parts of the Northwest Territory.
Yeah, for me, the most interesting part of the story is that deep connection between some ethical sense that slavery is bad and then to a personal practice, a personal decision to consume a certain type of product, and then taking that and saying, well, no, I'm not going to do that anymore because that product doesn't speak to my sort of central values. And I think that's such a fascinating part of the story. And it's not a part of the story of abolition that I've ever heard until today. So thank you very much, Jordan. We've come to the end of our discussion, and I ask all of my guests to just give me their takeaways, their sort of big reflections on thinking about the anniversary of the United States of America's founding 250 years in the future. So what do you think when you look back at that Declaration of Independence?
I'm struck by these huge ideas and these timeless ideas, maybe most eloquently described in the Declaration of Independence, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and that they have certain inalienable rights. I'm struck by who wrote them. People, men, people, flawed people, as any people are, but people who engaged in a thinking of what was possible. I think that they spoke aspirationally about how society could progress and how society could deliver these ideas to more and more people. And that took time, right? And I think I'm also struck by kind of language in the U.S. Constitution, the idea of creating a more perfect union. Never an idea that it was perfect or that they had arrived. But I think about the Declaration of Independence as kind of unleashing ideas that have had tremendous effects on human history and that can have even more tremendous effects in the future.
And we'll have a glass of rum to that. Thank you, Jordan Smith.
Thank you very much for having me.
Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The pursuit of happiness.
If you enjoyed this podcast and would like to support German-American friendship, why don't you visit us at our website, americatcentrum.de, where you can become a member and donate. The American Centrum is a nonpartisan and not-for-profit institution dedicated to strengthening the transatlantic relationship. The views and opinions expressed in the episode are those of the guests or the host, not the American Centrum. We take our nonpartisan mission seriously. Therefore, we do not take any institutional positions on politics or policy. Learn more about us, become a member, and donate at americatcentrum.de. Thanks for listening.